Thank you, Sanya, also for organizing this, and of course for finding this beautiful place which is hosting us today. It is worth being here just for this place alone, I guess. My talk today will be actually a kind of a brief, because we don't have so much time, a commentary of Clooney Brown, which is a movie, the last movie actually that Ernst Lubitsch made. It was made in 1946. And it is not only his last movie, but perhaps also his strangest. There is kind of a shift, I would say, to some kind of a strange modernity in it that I really like and appreciate a lot. It is definitely the strangest romantic comedy ever done, and I will come to this in a moment. So if you look at the summaries of the movie, they like to describe its main character, Clooney Brown, played by Jennifer Jones, as a kind of spontaneous, free spirit who lives in the moment. Yet I would say that this somehow misses the point, because Clooney Brown is decidedly not what one usually call kind of the pathos of a free spirit living in the moment. The pathos encapsulated, for example, in the famous maxim, carpe diem, seize the day. She certainly doesn't know or see herself as a free spirit. Actually, she's impulsive, really impulsive, and particularly subject to one impulse, namely fixing the pipes. Whenever there is a congestion, a sink that wouldn't drain, a pipe problem, anything to do with plumbing, her passion takes over and makes her act inappropriately, of course, out of place, as well as against her best interest. As she herself most brilliantly puts it, she says, "You know what plumbing does to me. I just can't keep my hands off it." So this is kind of a description of her character. So she's not exactly a free spirit, you see, in this sense. She's completely subjected to this strange passion, and actually I would say her freedom comes precisely from this subjection. It is not this kind of abstract freedom. What makes her or allows her to break free at some point is precisely this complete enslavement to this particular passion of hers. So, and of course one has to admit that for a love story, a romantic comedy, the female character has a very strange, bizarre, unromantic passion. It is not, for example, that she wants to be a journalist or a pilot or some other glamorous male profession, which is a configuration actually often encountered in comedies, in Hollywood comedies as well. These journalist women who try to make it in the men's world and so on. But fixing the clogged pipes and relieving the drain does not belong to this glamorous category. Her passion is somehow at odds with the very genre in which it appears, which, as romantic comedy, also supposes that at the end people marry. And as she again puts it most concisely, she says at some point, "You see, men just don't marry plumbers," which of course is very true, to some extent. So, and she actually finds this out the hard way. I will not go today here into many different layers of the story of the story of the movie, of what it can tell us also about different concepts in psychoanalysis. I will focus briefly and exclusively on the two love stories of Clooney Brown that give the movie its structure, and actually this kind of relates to what I think will be the future program coming up in this same place, the movies on love, on different way of loving and different love encounters. I will actually focus on this in Clooney Brown as well. So we have two very different love stories in the movie. One that could be described as one that excludes this impossible object of her passion, and one that includes it. One in which love follows more or less, we could say, a fantasy scenario. Fantasy also in this kind of a conceptual Lacanian, Freudian meaning of the term. And the other love story that involves a very different love, I would say a kind of genuine comic love, which is precisely not this kind of pathos of tragic or fantasy-related love. So with the help of the movie, I will simply try to make a few points, a few conceptual points concerning this difference between these two kinds of articulations of love. And on the other hand, I think this kind of narrowed focus will allow me to show you some footage from the movie, which is really, really worth seeing. I think this is also one of the main reasons that we are here, and since you cannot watch the movie this evening, I think it is good to give you the opportunity to see a couple of bit longer parts from it, so that you can get a taste of Clooney Brown. So the story of the movie takes place actually in the pre-war England, just like 38, 39. And Clooney is an orphan. She lives with her uncle, who is himself a plumber. So this comes from there, you can imagine. And it seems that the basic educational mantra of this uncle is to tell her over and over again that she needs to learn and find her place in society. The problem is, of course, that given the symbolic configuration, so social and family configuration or structure, she simply has no place in this society. So she's the odd one out, so to say. And one of the two love stories of the movie could be actually summed up precisely as Clooney's desire to and effort to finally find and have a place in life, to have a family and so on, a husband. And this is the path on which, soon after coming to the countryside, where she is sent by her uncle to serve as a maid to an elderly aristocratic couple, once she comes to this countryside, she falls in love with the local pharmacist there. His name is Mr. Wilson. And actually it is enough for this Mr. Wilson just to express an interest in marrying her, for her to fully and genuinely in love. There is no irony here, although it happens like in this automatic way. And we are clearly on the side of this kind of a love as fulfillment of a fantasy scenario. And the way the movie shows us this, I think it's really ingeniously done. Most clearly and skillfully, we can even speak of, there is a certain moment which you will see later on, which we could speak about as the ravishing of Clooney Brown, to paraphrase the famous title of one of Marguerite Duras' novels, Le Ravissement de l'Or d'Estagne. So in following this love story, actually the movie skillfully plays upon a striking discrepancy between the really plain reality of this pharmacist and all his boring life, and Clooney's rapture, her being really taken and fascinated by all this. So everything related to the pharmacist is extremely boring, suffocating, prejudiced, and rigid. And yet Clooney is genuinely swept off her feet by the prospect of finally having a place, finding a home, finding a mother that she never had. For the pharmacist actually lives with his mother, and you will see the movie is actually worth seeing for the character of the mother alone, although she only appears twice. And if we've always wanted to see how Mrs. Bates, this is Anthony Parkinson's mother from Psycho, actually looked like when she was still alive, then this will be your chance. This is precisely, she's really this character, she's great. So this is also the mother that she could get by marrying this guy. And there is a very powerful scene that takes place when Clooney is invited to the pharmacist's home for the first time to meet his mother, precisely. Again, the whole scene is extremely creepy. The mother doesn't say a single word, but only keeps emitting these strange coughing sounds. The pharmacist turns out to be even more boring and painfully moralistic than expected, and yet Clooney is shown as being, again, genuinely happy. And the scene, I will show you, the scene reaches its climax in a sequence which manages to really capture and preserve the whole radical ambiguity of this configuration without turning it into a simple comedy. So the pharmacist undertakes to play a song on the harmonium. The harmonium is out of tune, the pharmacist plays awfully, and the song is terrible. The mother falls asleep and starts snoring. At the same time, you see, we get this series of close shots of Clooney listening and watching to all this with this expression of fracture, of the genuine bliss. And crucially, also, the scene does not simply play upon the comic contrast between the plain reality and Clooney's idyllic perception of it. Clooney's rapture doesn't simply make us laugh. We may be tempted a little bit, but this is not actually what drives the scene. In the way the scene is shot, in the way the camera actually, I would say, supports Clooney in her rapture, in her this complete discontinuity with what is going on, instead of simply revealing her unrealistic perception of reality as comical, there is something extremely interesting, something that cannot be simply laughed out, laughed away, something that remains in the air, irreducible as it is to any description of positive reality. And I think this is really the best picturing of this kind of love, if you want, what is it in it anyway, besides everything else that we can laugh about. So I will now try to find this clip. Just let me see. No, I think it's already here. So I first do this, I guess.
Światło?
Escape.
Nie, światło samo do
Space.
Space, yeah. She comes to his home now for the first time.
Ah, what an elegant room.
Well, it's not Buckingham Palace, but it's Wilson's little castle. You might enjoy looking at this picture, Miss Brown. It's painted by hand.
Poor little sheep. It hasn't much future, has it? Just mutton.
And where would England be without it? If I was a sheep, I should be proud to serve the Empire. Now, Miss Brown, would you like to know where you are?
Yes, I would.
Then let us have a glance at the map of our valley.
Just look at that. Are they battle flags?
Well, not exactly a battle, Miss Brown, but a victory nevertheless. This is where I was born. And this is where we are at this very moment. And this is where I intend to remain for the rest of my life. Here in this very house.
Oh, you have everything so perfectly planned. But what if the house burns down?
Well, I considered that too. It won't. I've taken every precaution. You may have noticed the lightning rod on the roof, Moulton's Imperial Pinpoint, the very best. And if I should ever be blessed with little Wilsons, I should expect Mrs. Wilson to keep matches away from them. That isn't asking too much, is it?
Oh, no. I think that's the least Mr. Wilson could expect from Mrs. Wilson.
Now I shall call my mother. Or however, if in spite of all my provisions a slight blaze should occur, it may reassure you to know that I am chief of the Friars Carmel Volunteer Fire Department.
Oh, Mr. Wilson, you are.
I am.
It would be almost worth a fly to see you in action.
Thank you, Miss Brown. Mother. Mother. Mother's been resting. Mother, I wanted to meet our guest. And now, Miss Brown, if you have no objection, I shall play something on the harmonium.
Oh, you play the harmonium too? Is there anything you don't do, Mr. Wilson?
You have your choice. Sweet Alice, bend bold, or flow gently, sweet Alice.
They're both so beautiful. I wish you'd decide for me, Mr. Wilson.
Then shall we say Sweet Alice, and maybe Sweet Upton as an uncle? Ready, Miss Brown?
Okay, this is this first clip. I think you could see the contrast and how, I don't know, I really like this part precisely because it allows Clooney to play it out precisely, this kind of thing that she's completely into at this point. And now I will actually very briefly move to the point where this fantasy scenario breaks down. And how it breaks down, how this idyllic setting is interrupted by, we will see by what, perhaps I won't tell you immediately. I think it's a case examples actually of what can eventually break down a fantasy scenario, and it happens during a small dinner party that Mr. Wilson organizes to celebrate Mrs. Wilson, his mother's birthday, and during which he is also about to announce his engagement with Clooney to his friends. He invites a couple of friends and he wants to announce there also that he's engaged to Clooney and that they're about to be married. And now you will see, I will show you what happens. I think it's nicely to follow this immediately upon this first clip. Now, just now I have to find the right time, which is... From here, it will come in like 10 seconds. But
Not in the desert, nor anywhere. I give it a knock
it's
out.
not ideal, but it will come in.
Thank you.
Mother, friends, as the Romans so aptly put it, tempora mutanda. That is to say, times change. 65 years ago, Mother wasn't even here. And today she has been here 65 years. Tempora certainly do mutanda.
Thank you.
But before we examine those 65 well-spent years, Let me thank you all who came to celebrate this joyous occasion. You, Mr. Snaffle, Mrs. Snaffle, Miss Snaffle, Mr. Tupham, Mrs. Tupham, and Mr. Latham. Perhaps you notice that I am guilty of an omission. But when you hear later what I had to say, or better, to announce, concerning a young lady not too far away, I am sure you will agree that sometimes an omission is an admission.
I didn't do it. It's the woman. I just tilted the tap. It's the woman, Mama. Don't say that. I didn't know. Don't be quiet.
Let's go on. 65 years. 65 years of useful service.
I can fix it.
I beg your pardon.
Some of you might not know it, but I'm a plumber's niece. Just give me a hammer and a wrench and I'll show you. I'll get it, Miss Clooney. I know the hammer.
Miss Clooney, I wish you wouldn't.
Oh, there's nothing to it. It won't take more than 5 minutes. And then nothing will interrupt your announcement. I might not cook the best tripe and onions in England, but whoever gets me won't have to worry about his plumbing. Here you are, Miss Clooney. It's a joint from the Granny's might do it. If not, we'll try something else. That's my birthday gift to your mother, Mr. Wilson. Mrs. Wilson.
Good night, Mrs. Wilson.
Good night. Good night, Mrs. Wilson.
Mother, what? What's the matter? Is your mother ill?
No. Mother just wanted to be excused.
Goodness me, it's getting late.
Yes, we really must be going. It's quite late.
Thank you very much for a delightful evening.
I hope it wasn't too much for your mother, my boy.
I hope not.
Good night, Mr. Wilson. Good night, Mr. Wilson.
Good night, Mr. Wilson. Good night, Mr. Wilson.
Good night, Mr. Wilson.
Thanks for letting me watch, Clooney. You were a great help.
Come on, Ronald.
Did I do something wrong?
I wish I hadn't seen what I saw.
I was only trying to help.
Okay, so this is how what happens. All of a sudden, this thing appears. This passion of hers breaks through in the middle of this fantasy scene, and I think what is really ingenious in the way Lubitsch films this breakdown of fantasy is that we can clearly see that perhaps contrary to what we may believe or expect, fantasy does not get to be broken subjectively. It is not, for instance, that Clooney Brown suddenly realizes how awful Mr. Wilson and his mother really are. Actually, she never quite realizes this. Rather, the fantasy gets to be broken objectively. And this is because, as Lubitsch rightfully suggests, he's probably read his Lacan in his time, that it is also propped up by something objective or object-related, if we can put it this way. You could say that what the fantasy, the screen of fantasy screens off is not simply the real in the sense of objective, raw objective reality. At no point does the movie suggest that Clooney has finally become aware of the reality such as it really is, but rather it screens off some real of the subject herself. In this case, precisely this unbecoming, out-of-place passion of Clooney Brown. And this fantasy scenario breaks down or starts breaking down when this passion unexpectedly reappears at the very peak of her fantasy. So this thing happens, it appears. And since there is absolutely no support for it in the configuration of the people, as you saw gathered there, except for the little boy who admires Clooney, and I think we could see a hint here at what Freud called infantile sexuality as polymorphous perversion. You know, there is a certain, I think, clin d'œil that Lubitsch makes in this direction. So, as there is nothing in this scene, nobody to actually intersect this passion, this desire, it appears as an object of disgust. Everybody is disgusted by what happened. So people turn around and leave, and Clooney is forced to realize a couple of things. She realizes that her fantasy is actually absolutely incompatible with this particular thing. And we'll see later on in a bit how she still tries to kind of rationalize this incompatibility in a desperate attempt to save her fantasy. So, but although we learn that Mr. Wilson has nevertheless decided to give her another chance, it is clear that the rupture is over for Clooney, and that if she nevertheless finds her place with Mr. Wilson, alongside Mr. Wilson, it would be without this kind of genuine happiness that we saw in the first scene that I showed you, and that existed for her up to this point. This point really breaks something. If she is to stay on the side of this fantasy, she has to compromise now her desire. And she was not aware of this before. This is a very important, I think, lesson that we learn here, which could also be formulated as follows. Namely, it is not that we ever get to kind of choose between fantasy and following some other non-phantasmatic desire or object. Rather, whenever fantasy appears, I mean, according to Lacan, fantasy is the very screen through which we look upon reality. It is what frames the reality for us. It is not something on display in the reality for us to choose or not. And whenever we live through this fantasy, the choice is already done, and it is fully effective. There is no effort in it or no decision. And we can be perfectly happy in spite of what might be the obvious flaws in the situation, which we genuinely don't experience as such, as flaws. And this is, I would say, the first part, the first clip that I showed you. The problem begins when this fantasy scenario starts cracking. There are cracks that appear in it, it starts breaking down, and then we think that perhaps we can still mend it, fix it somehow. If I only did this or that, or if I only didn't do this or that, this is the classical formula of this kind of fantasy mending. And I think it is only here that a choice actually does appear for the first time, a possible alternative between, on the one hand, to desperately trying to keep the fantasy scenario alive, and an alternative scenario to this. And in our case, this alternative is, of course, plumbing, or follow the call of the plumbing, which is like a libidinal compound of Clooney's out-of-placeness in the movie. So the possible other choice for Clooney would thus be to live, so to say, with the uninvited surprise guest that crashed the party of her fantasy, to recognize it as her most joyful, albeit unhuman partner. But how? How is this possible? Can this even happen? And this actually brings us to the other love story of the movie that I want to briefly touch upon. And this is Clooney's love story with the actually chief male protagonist of the film, Professor Adam Belinsky. There are all these professors in Lubitsch's movies. Professor Belinsky is played in the movie by Charles Boyer. This Belinsky is himself a Czech refugee, and of course this status of his is of crucial importance in the structure of the movie, since like Clooney, the professor has also no place of his own. He doesn't belong anywhere. His address is, as he puts it, general delivery. And he seems to even like it, contrary to Clooney. So he isn't looking for a place in life. He's a philosopher, acquainted with psychoanalysis as well. And it looks like this general delivery address is somehow in tune with his idea of freedom. He's more of a free spirit, if you want, the way I spoke about it at the beginning. And this kind of freedom is also the elected object of his studies and concerns. So Belinsky and Clooney meet for the first time during the opening sequence of the movie. At the very beginning, before they both, by coincidence, meet again on the same countryside estate that Clooney was sent to serve as a maid. And when they first meet, Clooney is actually on a kind of self-appointed plumbing mission. She comes to a guy in London who is desperate because he's giving a party and his sink is clogged and he couldn't find a plumber, so she kind of steps in and comes there to fix the pipes. And Professor Belinsky is there by coincidence as well. So there they meet for the first time. They hit it off immediately in the midst of Clooney's plumbing activities. And this Professor Belinsky is absolutely taken in by Clooney's weird passion, and he immediately provides her with something that proves to be much more solid and reliable than a place of one's own, namely a sentence, a formula that encapsulates actually the unexpectedness of her desire. And this formula is, hence the title of my paper, Squirrels to the Nuts. So instead of nuts to the squirrels, squirrels to the nuts. And I will now show you this passage when they first meet, as I said, under the sink there at this guy's place in London. So now we go.
Joe stopped up, but I thought I'd have a fling at it myself.
But look here, are you a plumber?
Oh, no. But I've been around pipes and sewers and taps and things ever since I came to live with Uncle Arn. And, of course, I've watched him work. He's a good plumber. But if you ask me, much too conservative.
Conservative?
Though he votes Labour. But when it comes to pipes, he takes the long road. Fiddles and fattens. Turns a nut, gets a drop here and a drip there, when one good bang might turn the trick in a jiffy.
Yes, and might smash the pipe to smithereens.
But on the other hand, it mightn't. And when you're up against time, you have to chance it. Why don't you let me have a whack at it?
Oh, no, you don't.
My dear Abe, where's the gypsy in you? Where's your sense of adventure? Are you the type of man who puts on his pants before he answers the telephone? What if the thing does go wrong? Let's assume the whole place gets flooded and there is no party. You sell your liquor. Is that bad? But if this girl succeeds...
Please, sir, do let me.
By Jove, I'll do it. Yes, I'll do it. Come on. Relieve the drain, relieve the strain, eh? Well, there it is. My fate's in your hands.
My. What a congestion. More stopped up than you sounded. I never thought it'd be as good as this. I can't thank you enough, Mr. Haynes.
Oh, not at all. You know, I'm having a party.
Yes, I know, but I'm not at all certain I can stay. We'll see. You see, she's not dressed for plumbing. But what woman is?
Well, here we go. Last Saturday. I was lying in bed sucking oranges to tone up the system, you know. And all at once I said to myself, Clooney Brown, you've got a pound note in your stocking. Why don't you have tea at the Ritz? So I did. That's the way things come over me.
Was it a good tea?
Oh, it wasn't the tea, but to hear them say, this way, miss, please, miss, crumpets, miss, and holding my chair for me, you never thought I was out of place.
That's very interesting. You don't seem to be inhibited. Title must be sinking. When did you think you were out of place?
Oh, I didn't think I was. It's Uncle Arn. He's always telling me, Clooney Brown, you don't know your place. Think of your place. Clooney Brown, you ought to learn your place.
Look here, this is no time for light conversation.
What does Uncle Arn think your place is?
He didn't say.
Because he doesn't know.
I say it's 10 to 5.
Nobody can tell you where your place is. Where's my place? Where is anybody's place? I'll tell you where it is. Wherever you're happy, that's your place. And happiness is a matter of purely personal adjustment to your environment. You're the sole judge. In Hyde Park, for instance, some people like to feed nuts to the squirrels. But if it makes you happy to feed squirrels to the nuts, who am I to say nuts to the squirrels?
Do you mind saying that all over again?
In Hyde Park. Look, I beg.
This actually looks like a kind of consummation of their first encounter. I mean, the relationship is quite fun. The scene that. Okay, so this is the way they meet with Professor Belinsky for the first time, and as you can see, it's a very different kind of meeting. And actually their discussion, I find it here below the scene, bears some resemblance to a psychoanalytic session, because Clooney does the talking, she does the planning as well, whereas Belinsky kind of provides her with a formula of her, I would say, this being towards plumbing, if I can be allowed this paraphrase of Heidegger's being towards death. So there it is, squirrels to the nuts. This is what he tells her here. She asks him to repeat it, and then you have this kind of a relief in the drain being relieved. And actually this squirrels to the nuts becomes a kind of code word between them. It is the very form and also substance of their bond. The thing that binds them, I would say, in the real. It is not so much emotions or fantasy as this praise that kind of really binds them and remains there between them till the end, because it is really only at the end that this kind of has a kind of a sequel, although they meet again at the countryside, but there Clooney is completely into her story with Mr. Wilson. So for the rest of the movie almost until the end, their relationship will remain at this kind of this formula. And there is, of course, a strong and obvious complicity between them. They enjoy each other's company. The desire is there as well, although in Clooney's case, this desire is kind of disavowed on account of his not being her type, she says at some point. The type to provide her with a place in life, we may suppose. Whereas he seems to be reluctant to make a more definitive move, not only because of Clooney's infatuation with Wilson, which is also a factor, of course, but also because of his not being exactly a marrying type, as the expression goes. So the bond between them is maintained by this formula, which is repeated there, 3 more times in the movie. And the third and the last time, it occurs actually at the critical moment of Clooney's story, with the pharmacist, which I showed you before. This is after her fantasy breaks down. This is precisely the moment where Clooney is about, I would say, to give up on her strange plumbing desire, and she really desperately tries to kind of fit into this Mr. Wilson's configuration, her fantasy, and be happy like this. At that point in the movie, Belinsky is about to leave the estate and return to London, having come to the conclusion that his efforts with Clooney are in vain, since she has only eyes for Mr. Wilson. He doesn't know how badly the previous evening had turned for Clooney when her plumbing passion erupted in the midst of Wilson's party. So he wants to leave, and before Belinsky leaves for the train station, he asks the housekeeper to give Clooney his farewell gift, silk stockings, and she also asks her to give her a message. This message goes as follows. He wishes her every happiness, and should she ever feel depressed, she is to close her eyes and say squirrels to the nuts. Then he leaves for the station, and Clooney, upon receiving the gift and this message shortly afterwards, she runs to the station, to the train station. So she's really upset because he left before she could say anything to him, so she runs to the train station. And there, in front of the train, Belinsky and Clooney have what looks and sounds like their second psychoanalytic session. Actually, you will see, I will show you the clip, but just to give you a little bit what to be attentive to, Belinsky lets her speak and makes sure that she hears what she's saying. I mean, there is this kind of analytic setting. Her speech is full of what I earlier referred to as Clooney's rationalizations, you know. It is not Mr. Wilson's fault, I behaved foolishly, and so on and so on. Wilson will give her another chance. And Belinsky, all through this speech of hers, Belinsky abstains from commenting or comforting her or anything. He simply lets her talk and become less and less sure of what she's saying. However, when the whistle blows to signal the imminent departure of the train, Belinsky intervenes in a very direct manner. Actually, he orders Clooney to get into the train compartment, and this is really, you will see the strangest moment in the movie. She complies without so much as a twitch. Actually, Clooney's attitude in this scene is quite strange. Her passage from Wilson to Belinsky takes place as if she were kind of sleepwalking, in utter passivity, and without, I would say, without psychology. The movie does not attempt to suggest that Clooney has suddenly realized that deep down she doesn't really love Wilson and that she really loves Belinsky. She simply enters the train, sits down, and after a while she asks, "Where are we going?" And then once she gets the reply, which of course is general delivery, she wakes up, and all of a sudden we are already in the midst of this other love story, following a very different logic than the previous one, and really rushing forward to the film happy ending with the speed of the speeding train, because then the movie ends like a couple of minutes after the scene that I will now show you. So you will see how this very interesting moment, how I really like this completely stripped off of any psychology, how this passage takes place in the movie. So this now will be our last clip. Let me see.
Mr. Belinsky! Mr. Belinsky!
Clooney!
Oh, Mr. Belinsky, I want to thank you. They're beautiful. Why didn't you say goodbye to me? You know, we might never see each other again.
Yes, I know, Clooney.
It's kind of awful to think of.
Yes, it is awful. But how's Mr. Wilson?
Oh, he's better.
Was he sick?
No, he was upset about his mother.
What's the matter with her?
She was upset about me. Mr. Belinsky, I disgraced myself last night. Everybody thought so. Mr. Snaffle, Mrs. Snaffle, and especially Mr. Latham.
What did you do, Clooney?
Well, you know what plumbing does to me. Just can't keep my hands off it. And I didn't last night. Oh, I don't blame Mr. Wilson. You know, Mr. Belinsky, men just don't marry plumbers. Mr. Wilson had a long talk with me afterwards. He told me what he thought of me. Some of it was enlightening. He said, with his standing in the community, he cannot afford a wife who is subject to impulses, either to pipes or to himself. That's when he banged on the table. Now, you believe everything is over between us, wouldn't you? Well, it isn't. Mr. Wilson is a very generous man. He's going to ask his mother to give me another chance. That's very kind, isn't it? No one could expect more. So if everything turns out all right, I might still be Mrs. Jonathan Wilson. That is, if I don't behave foolishly again. And I won't. I'm certainly going to watch myself. One can't be foolish and have a place in life, can one?
Get in. Get in.
Where are we going, Mr. Belinsky?
General delivery.
Are you expecting a letter?
Always. That's what's so wonderful about general delivery. Letters pour into it. Millions of them. Greetings from all over the world.
You know, I've passed it many times and I've never thought of that. You do make one see things.
And among all those millions of letters, there might be one for us, Clooney. It might be very disappointing, but it might be good news. It might come from America.
Mr. Belinsky, you sound as though you like me.
Clooney, if I were rich, I would build you the most beautiful mansion with the most exquisite and complicated plumbing. And right in the middle of the most elegant housewarming party, I would hand you a hammer and say, ladies and gentlemen, Madame Clooney Belinsky is about to put the pipes in their place.
Mary Belinsky. That's as good as Mrs. Belinsky, isn't it?
So, and I think it's very interesting because here it's not only, okay, you could see this is the perfect happy ending, now this will be this kind of a passion-driven relationship, but as you can see, she keeps her tick, she really jumps at this, Madame Belinsky, this is as good as Mrs. It's not that she gave up on her place in life, it kind of comes from another corner, but nevertheless, so this is the end, and very briefly, I mean, there are some very funny comic scenes after this, but just like a couple of minutes, and then it's the end of the movie, it's the happy ending, they kind of hit it off, and he starts actually writing and publishing bestsellers so that he can live in this spot. So, but what I really like about this passage that I showed you is this kind of a strange passivity, this Untergang, subjective Untergang, eclipse of the subject. Clooney is not appearing as the subject of this transition, let's say, from one love to another. Of course, it could appear as a kind of remains of a conservative view on female passivity, but I really think that on the contrary, it is rather the sign of Lubitsch's revolutionary spirit, precisely this kind of interruption, subjective discontinuity in the emergence of this kind of love. So, how much time? Yeah, I will try to make this point as briefly as possible. So it is a kind of transition from one kind of love to another, from one that is framed by, let's say, the window of fantasy, to a different kind triggered by a window of opportunity. Precisely this is what happens here. He gives her the opportunity to pursue this other thing. And there is something involved here that I think we could call, or I would call, the Lubitchian chivalry, not to be confused with a conservative view on sexual roles and position. Men rescue women, and vice versa, both happen in Lubitsch's movies, but they don't rescue them from physical danger. They don't rescue them from being dishonored or disgraced or whatever. The only danger that men can rescue women from, and vice versa, is the danger of precisely giving up on their desire. To use the famous Lacanian formula, this, ne pas céder sur son désir. And it is not that women lack the courage or strength to pursue their desire. According to Lubitsch, and I would say to comedy in general, not to give up on your desire is always already a kind of objective configuration. It is not simply a personal or deeply subjective matter. So I will just, to conclude my talk, very briefly stop at this Lacanian ethical formula, which Lacan proposes in his reading of Antigone, actually, this ne pas céder sur son désir, do not give up on your desire, or as he puts it more directly, the only thing that we can be guilty of is to give up on one's desire, on our desire. In his later work, Lacan more or less abandoned this formula and its heroic overtones. But I would maintain, however, that there nevertheless remains something valid and valuable in this formula, and that this something comes to light precisely when we move from tragedy to comedy. For what changes in this passage is, I would say, the very configuration of desire at stake. So what would be this difference? We could simply say that in its tragic paradigm, not to give up on your desire is a subjective and solitary business. It is a heroic enterprise of fidelity to some kind of a lost cause, carried out by the subject in the unbroken continuity of her will and her determination. So one insists upon it whatever the cost, even if one has to die. And the fidelity manifests itself in the fact that nothing comes even close, of course, to this lost thing, which functions only as a firm criterion of elimination, leading us to conclude at each and every particular thing that this is not it. This is the basic part. This is not it, but we will never be satisfied with whatever substitute may come to embody this thing. So we have this kind of solitary business and this kind of a continuity of the subjectivity that usually dies defending it, dies for this cause. In comedy, on the other hand, it is clear, I think, that not giving up on your desire is something more objective than subjective. It involves an interruption of the subject, this kind of absentness, strange decline of the subjectivity that we saw in this last scene. This interruption of the subject, which of course is precisely triggered by an unexpected emergence of this thing, of this it, of this impossible object that occurred in this previous scene. And at the same time, precisely because of this discontinuity of the subject, it cannot simply be a solitary business, not giving up on one's desire. It cannot be something that subject can carry out all by herself. Or we could say, perhaps, to not give up on your desire takes at least two. We need a little help with this, a little collective also. We need a little help from, for instance, someone who helps us get on the train at the right moment. Had there been no Mr. Belinsky at the train station, Clooney might have ended under the train, and so would her unorthodox desire. And this is well known from world literature. So this would perhaps be more realistic. But of course, the mission of comedy is not about this kind of realism. It is not about saving or not saving Clooney Brown. It is about not giving up on this particular surplus object, which not only drives the comedy, but also is the key to our objective, unhuman human standing in the world. And I think we could say, if this entails saving Clooney Brown, so be it. You see what I'm getting at. If tragedy ultimately sacrifices the subject to save this precious object, this thing in the subject worth more than the subject, then comedy is something that not simply reverses the order of values here to suggest that actually we are more precious than this thing in us. What comedy suggests is something else, namely that this inhuman thing is precisely what makes us worth saving. So, and here I think we really come across something that I would put say that it is the Lubitsch in a nutshell, across the radical, this comical edge in all its unhuman radicality. Namely, Clooney's survival is, so to speak, the collateral damage of saving her object. And this is precisely where this kind of anti-humanism of Lubitchian comedy hits the nerve of what it means to be human or a human being. And I think this is really why this movie is definitely worth seeing. Okay, this is basically what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may add, if somebody has a question or impression or something to comment on or to ask, now is your chance. And if nobody does, I would like to ask Mario Vukovic, who is our next speaker. I'll just give his brief biography. Thank you.
Shall we do questions, or are we?
Do
Are we gonna just? How do we do? Are we gonna do questions?
Yelena proposed if there are any questions. If you do have questions, I would like to say.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you for this reading. I really like it. And I was just curious what you had to say about a reading that I would like to maybe push that I think would contribute to some of the things that you said. So it seems to me that misrecognition plays a major role in the movement of the plot. So, Clooney shows up, and there's some sense that she's been misrecognized as a guest. And before that, Belinsky shows up in the beginning, and there's some kind of misrecognition that's happening there. And I really love the scene when Clooney shows up to the manor, and she's sort of misrecognized as a friend of some other aristocrat or something. And so I guess, maybe that would be one part, this whole idea that none of the characters actually seem to, they're all kind of missing each other, or missing any kind of identification with their actual places, or whatever. So how might that contribute to?
As I said, this is really a pity we could speak about this movie for the whole afternoon, because it really has, this is just, I tried to shorten this presentation as much as possible, also to be able to show you some of the footage, because I think it's also important if one speaks of the movie to see a little bit of texture, but actually this is definitely one of the main there is also another love story of Belinsky with this aristocratic woman there and her troubles with this guy who cannot ask. There are lots of subplots in the movie, and there is of course there is the war, the menace of the war behind it, which is also referred to very often, and there are kind of discussions that are extremely interesting in this respect as well. And then there is this kind of constant misrecognition, and the scene that you mentioned is actually quite ingenious, because Clooney comes to this mentioned in the company of a guy that she meets on the train, whatever, elderly aristocrat, and they think that, yeah, she's his niece, and they treat her, the couple, where she comes to serve as a maid, they treat her very differently from this. This is to say, as a lady, and she doesn't seem to notice that there is something wrong with this. This is part of her character, that she's not, she thinks that she's perfectly in her place, even though they kind of really serve on her and stuff, and she thinks this is completely natural. And then there is this kind of extremely painful moment when she realizes that she was mistaken for somebody else, and so on. So this whole thing of how much of what we are is actually in the way the other people behave towards us, and how this defines us, and where is this, how this can be shifted, in what ways, and this is definitely something that movie not only plays with a lot, but also tries to give some very precise formulations of. So yeah, and this could be all, the talk could be on this as well, because it's a very, very, one of the main interests of the movie. Yeah.
And then just two short comments, I mean, especially about the end of the paper. I was just thinking, this reversal of tragedy and comedy, that you could say in tragedy, I mean, normally the everyday tragedy is that I'm burdened with some symptoms that like screw up my life. And that comedy affects a reversal where it's not that I'm burdened by this kind of appendage, my symptom, but I become the appendage of the symptom.
Oh, precisely,
in the comedy. So I just quite like this idea of a reversal. But my other comment was, the other thing that I think is, that I really like about the paper is you could imagine a humanist reading of the film, which would basically be about the triumph of nonconformity. Right? You know, you could imagine, let's say if I was a different kind of film critic, I could, you know, this film really celebrates, Clooney Brown is always put in her place, but actually it's a kind of triumph of the nonconformist spirit over the kind of social conformity. And, you know, I think what I like, or what is very interesting, is the way you undermine that, because you could also then imagine, you know, so much of culture is actually an imperative to nonconformity. I mean, since the 60s, like, you should be nonconformist, and that becomes a new weird model of conformity. So you could kind of, you know, imagine this ideological reading. But the one thing you can't recuperate is precisely that emphasis on the passivity.
Yeah,
like, you can't say, like, become, like, super passive. It just makes no sense. And so that's what really interests me, this idea that Clooney Brown actually undergoes, involuntarily, a kind of symbolic death and rebirth. And I think that's something you can also find in tragedies. I mean, in a weird way, in a weird short circuit, it also kind of happens to Hamlet. That there's a certain moment where there's just a sudden shift in his character, but it's not sort of a psychological realization. It's just, I mean, she just enters a zombie state. So there's just kind of a death of the old Clooney and a birth of a new, and there's just kind of a gap.
Yeah, this is actually, there is a part that I left out, which is, when this is a little bit elaborated a little bit more, but I think it is it is even connected, the two comments that you made, the one about the object being actually something that we as subjects are attached to, and that this thing is actually what drags us along. This is a very, very typical characteristic of comedy, and I think in this the way that Lubitsch already, I mean, this is what my reading kind of underlines, but I think it's clearly there in Lubitsch already in the movie, that it is not to be read as a triumph of nonconformity. And this actually starts at the very beginning, when this is, because precisely she is not presented as this kind of a, at no moment, really, there is this moment in the movie when she realizes, okay, now I am to be free. Now it is really, even when this passive transition takes place and she changes this other guy, you can really see also that she is really saved by this object. That in her head, it's still about family and marrying and whatever. But nevertheless, it is precisely this thing that kind of makes for her the passage to this other story. And it is precisely not at all something that can be translated in any kind of triumph of love or triumph of non-conformity, but precisely triumph of this thinking as more than us, which can be nevertheless, as the movie shows, a very good ground for a nice love story. Yeah, but it's precisely the other way around, and this is why I think really this scene is quite unique in, or one of the quite unique scenes in the movie history, especially romantic comedy, which is different. I mean, the movie that we will see this evening is a little bit more ordinary in this sense. I mean, although it's great with the shop around the corner, but it's the more usual people. Although there are ticks that point in this direction as well in the shop around the corner.
Yeah, I think there is another reference, a Lacanian reference, very interesting with with the question of passivity and objectivity is a quilt, the point capiton. And the father slew, Lacan said, il faut que cela circule.
Mm-hmm.
And what she does with the plumbery and pipes is exactly what a quilt. So it's over the Freudian sexual reference, you have a reference to this quilt, I think. And it's funny because the father slew, La Loi du Père in this film is the mother, because her sound is exactly the same as the plant.
Yes, there is something there. Yes, yeah. So there is a very strong competition. Yes, you can see no, this is definitely, thank you. Because it's also, there is this idea even more, perhaps not so much directly to sexuality as related to the Lacanian concept of the drive, you know, this kind of, the only aim is to return to the circuit, as he said. So, so it's kind of interesting, and I even think that if you remember the first scene of the movie, which is to say the third scene that I showed you, when they meet with Belinsky, when there is this really disgusting scene that you see, and I think, and the way she's fascinated by this, I think the scene comes close to uncomfortable, and that actually it is the sexual innuendo that saves it, that translates it into a more kind of, okay, we know about it, it's something sexual, but actually it's even more traumatic. There is something of the pure drive, which is not directly sexual, where you consider sexual innuendo actually comes as something that frames this in a more traditional way, like some kind of sexual reference. But there you have a kind of more radical layer of sexuality, which is this kind of a completely bizarre drive-related thing, which is her thing, yeah, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else wants to say something? Thank you.
I think we have,
now we'll call Mario Karic.